Okay, well, welcome and good afternoon. We'd like to go ahead and get started with our K-State Garden Hour series. Thank you for joining us today. The series is hosted by K-State Research and Extension. My name is Ron Honig. I'm the Crops and Horticulture Agent in the Wild West District. So before we get started, we have a couple of housekeeping notes to cover. So please use the Q&A feature for questions related to the presentation. So this is where we'll look for questions during the Q&A session at the end. You should see a button along the bottom tab that says Q&A. So just click on that and you should be able to enter your question. Our moderator is Brooke Garcia, and she is a training support specialist in the Department of Entomology. And she's been behind the scenes in developing this series. And Brooke will be keeping track of the questions that come in. And we're going to do our best to get through all the questions at the end today. Today's webinar will be recorded, and we will post it to our K-State Garden Hour website. We typically upload some additional resources related to each topic as well. You also have access to the previous topics and some of the upcoming topics in the series on the website. So our moderator she'll send a link for this over the chat. We have recently added several extra events to the series. So some are the kind of the garden favorites that include tree planting, spring flowering bulbs, and composting. So we'll continue a week-to-week schedule through the end of September, and then we'll go to one topic per month, October through December. The events in this series have also been promoted on the K-State Horticulture and Natural Resources Facebook page. So Brooke will also provide that link. So with our Facebook page, you can kind of stay up to date with the horticulture and the natural resources department, as well as updated with the upcoming topics that in this series. So be sure to like and share and use the hashtag K-State Garden Hour to help us promote this program. So this webinar series has allowed us to continue to provide extension education related to horticulture and gardening, given the circumstances that we're in today. And everyone involved in the department in development of this series, is an extension professional for K-State. Most of us have a background in horticultural education or a related discipline. But most of all, each of us have a love for gardening and the natural environment and the outdoors. So today's topic, fall tree planting, how to do it right. And I'm really pleased to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Charles Barden. He's our K-State Extension Forestry Specialist. So Dr. Barden is going to share some tips and techniques on selecting and planting and staking and mulching trees, among a number of other things. And then we try to get through all your questions today as well. So if you'll just give us a few moments here, we'll make the transition over to Dr. Barden's presentation, and then we'll be ready to go. So thank you.
Thank you, Ron. Let me call out the presentation here, get on the first slide. Yeah. Okay, can everybody see the screen? Fall tree planting, how to do it right? If we can't, have one of the moderators let me know.
Good.
Great, thank you, Brooke. I have to admit, I was born and raised back in New England and got kind of spoiled on the fall foliage display that we see back there every year. It's a big tourism season. They call it leaf peeping season, and the people who come out to see it are called leaf peepers. They'll travel to New England just to see the show, primarily the maple trees when they're in full color in middle of October. But red maple is one we have real common back in New England. We call it swamp maple there because it usually grows around the edge of ponds and swamps where it's in just natural habitat. It calls it beautiful and red. And of course, the sugar maple is on the hillsides and planted around every town square, and they color up mostly brilliant orange in the fall. But then come out here in Kansas, and we're a little bit more limited on our palette of colors that we see in our trees. So the agenda for today, we'll talk a little bit about why do we plant in the fall. You know, usually planting is done in the spring, but why you can also plant in the fall. A little bit about how and why foliage changes color. If you kind of know the physiology behind it, you can help a tree along to get its maximum color. how to plant landscape trees. This is good for any time of the year, but going to go over tree planting tips, then talk a little bit about staking and mulching techniques, and then we'll stop there for some questions and then move on into some recommended trees for fall color that I found I'll color up well here in our more challenging Kansas and Midwest environment, and then end up with some questions, of course, at the end. So why do we recommend planting sometimes in the fall? Well, warm, moist soils at this time of year encourage root growth. The soils are still warm from the summer's heat, and you can water a planting hole and give it the moisture it needs, and it'll encourage root growth. Planting in the fall gives trees several months head start over spring planted trees, and they are better prepared for summer stress. They've done a number of studies where they'll plant trees in October and they'll plant them in April, and they'll be identical size at the time of planting, and they'll measure those trees a year later, 2 years later, and the fall planted trees will always be larger and better established than the spring planted trees. Also, a fall selection at the nursery allows you to confirm the fall color and timing you're looking for. If you pick out a tree that's supposed to color up nicely in the fall, but you pick that tree out in March or April, you may not be sure it's going to color up in the fall. So by selecting the planting stock in the autumn in October at the nursery allows you to confirm that that fall color is what you want, and you can dependably have that tree color up for you every year. Okay, a couple of reasons again why to plant in the fall. Well, roots and shoots actually grow in kind of opposite rhythms. At this time of year, as shoot growth is winding down, leaves are turning color, roots will actually start to put on a flush of root growth, as shown on the left-hand side of this curve, and that will peak at moderate soil temperatures and good soil moisture. Then as things get colder and colder, the root growth rate will go down, down, down. It'll bottom out and pretty much cease in midwinter, late December, January, when the ground is quite often frozen, very cold. But as soon as the ground thaws out, we start getting some spring rains, that root growth comes back again, it keeps increasing and peaks just before shoot growth happens in the spring. But once the shoot growth starts to expand, the leaves start to expand, that pretty much shuts down the root growth, and then it drops off again till those leaves are fully expanded, photosynthesizing, sending sugar down to the root system, and then we get back on the train again, and root systems start to grow again in June. And then again, maybe have a midsummer lull, then come back in the fall. This root we see on the right-hand side was from a tree I transplanted in my yard a couple of years ago as I was root pruning it, took off a piece, and you see all these little white tips of the new root growth. This was in middle of October and had nice, fresh, new root growth, these tender white tips on the tips of all these roots. And it's the white root tips that are actually best at absorbing nutrients. About the only thing that can absorb water in the soil is these white growing root tips. So if you have a good amount of new roots growing actively, you can get that tree established much more easily. Okay, a little bit of how do trees change color? Well, it's genetically driven, but with an environmental influence. For example, the yellow pigments, the carotenoids, are always present in the leaves, but as the green chlorophyll breaks down due to shorter days, then the yellows are revealed. The harder colors to get are the reds and purples. Those are from anthocyanins, and they're formed as sugars are trapped in the leaf in the fall. As the chlorophyll starts to break down, it's still functioning, it's still making sugar with photosynthesis, but the abscission layer is starting to be formed where the tree is getting ready to shed the leaf and cut it off from itself. So sugars are formed in the leaf, they can't be exported down to the root system, so instead they're stuck in the leaf and they undergo some biochemical changes and become anthocyanins, which are the red and yellow pigments. So the ideal weather for this kind of development is warm, sunny days and cool nights lead to brighter colors because the sunny days allows photosynthesis to occur, and the cool nights slows down respiration, so the sugar levels are built up in the leaf and the excess sugars become the anthocyanins. And finally, rainy weather can wash out the colors. It doesn't really wash out the colors like dissolve the pigments and rinse them or wash them away, but simply by having cloudy, rainy weather, you'll have less photosynthesis and you'll have less of the bright red colors being formed. Here's an example of the palette of colors that tree leaves can form by various types. I borrowed this from the Chicago Botanic Garden website. Of course, chlorophyll is the green color, xanthophyll is the light yellow, carotene is the dark yellow. Together, we call these the carotenoids. Again, anthocyanin is the reds and purples. And finally, tannin is the brown color. This is just when a leaf is dead and dying. the waste products and all make it just become brown leaves. And some of our oak species, the leaves go from green to olive green and then to brown, and they don't ever have this bright color along the way. Okay, so how do genetics influence the process? Well, different species, of course, have different tendencies to color up leaves in different colors. And also within the same species, a specimen, a tree from a northern seed source will grow slower, but will color up earlier in the fall. And trees from some sources do not color up much at all. Hence, choose trees for fall color in the autumn. Go to the nursery in October and look at the color of those tree leaves and select those specimens that are colored up nice. This picture here, these two green trees are actually northern red oaks from a neighbor of mine in my neighborhood there in Potawatomi County. And they saw the northern red oaks and color beautiful in red, this dark red, almost burgundy color. So they bought a matching set of northern red oak seedlings from the nursery, saplings from the nursery in the spring. And then every year, this smaller one colors up beautiful and dark red. The larger one behind it maintains its green leaves for a long time. And finally, in early November, we get a hard freeze and the leaves get killed. They all turn brown and quite often are stuck on the tree. So they wanted the effect of two matching northern red oaks with bright red fall foliage color. And instead, they got one tree that colors up nicely, one tree does not. And again, a way to prevent that is to select those trees in the fall at the nursery. So you already see the starting to red colors we see on this red oak leaf here. And you can be assured that they'll color up together with that same color in the fall. Okay, so shifting gears a little bit now, how to plant landscape trees. These are rules that pretty much apply to all planting spring or fall in the landscape. You might like to prepare a planting hole 2 or 3 times as wide as the root ball and slightly shallower than the root ball. You never want to make it deeper than the root ball, have the tree planted down into a basin. You need to prepare the root ball by teasing out or cutting any girdling roots. Girdling roots are ones that circle around the edge of the pot while it was growing in the pot. Try to keep the roots damp during this treatment because fine roots will die very quickly when exposed to the sun and wind and air. And so I keep a jug of water right there and I wet down the root ball as I'm doing this teasing out, this pulling out of the slender roots or the cutting of any girdling roots. And then measure the true root ball depth, which may be less than what you saw in the pot or what you saw in the ball and burlapped picture. So to measure the true root ball depth, you find the first major lateral root going out from the trunk out sideways, and then you measure the depth of the trimmed root ball. If you have to cut any roots from the bottom and tease out those roots, that may make the root ball more shallow. So get the true root ball depth by measuring it from the first lateral root down to the bottom of the trimmed root ball. Okay, I'm going to walk you through a few slides from a planting procedure that I performed a couple of years ago in the fall. This was a swamp white oak that I had picked up in early summer and said, well, June is not the time to plant a tree here in Kansas. I'm going to over summer it. I'll keep it growing in the summer. So I put it on the east side of the house so we just get morning sun, keep it well watered. This is what it looked like in mid-October. The leaves were starting to turn colors you see there with some yellow and brown leaves on it. And those roots we saw earlier with the growing root tips, they came from this tree here right at this season in October. It had all those growing root tips. So the first thing I do when I get the tree ready is I start to prepare the hole, as you can see here, because it takes a while to dig the hole. And if the root system is exposed and you've pruned it and you got it all ready, and then you have to dig the hole, that's the wrong order. The root system will be exposed to too much exposure, too much sun and wind, and end up with root damage. But I start to dig the hole. I'm not quite as ambitious to make it 3 times the size of the root diameter. This is close to twice the root diameter. And I see the depth is plenty deep because you can see where the lateral root is coming out. You can see where the depth should be. So I examined the roots, and in this particular case, the lateral roots were actually visible at the potting media surface. This is not typical, but we had a major lateral root growing sideways, actually above the potting soil surface. It exposed for probably at least a year in the system because it already had greenish color and had bark and lenticels on the root system. And typically roots won't have a green color and have bark. So that shows they've been exposed to the sunshine for quite a while. Also, as I move some of the potting media away, I could see that the tree had definitely spent some time in a square pot. You see these roots, they'd grown around the perimeter of a square pot at one time, and they were still very visible. So I trimmed away all these squared roots around the edge. Many of them were dead and non-functional anyway, but we didn't need that extra tissue there. But you see how the shape of the pot that the tree is growing in can lead to legacy effects over a long period of time. You can literally see the right angle of these roots as it grew around the square. Okay, as I look to the roots, I need to do some pruning. So I look for roots that are wrapped around the edge. Quite often they'll be wrapped around the bottom of the pot or somewhere in the middle if it was transplanted up from a smaller pot to a larger one. So you have these roots that are girdled or wrapped around the pot. It's very important to cut these or tease these out because roots do not unwrap after planting. Once the curve of that root is set and it's wrapped around the root system, it doesn't unwrap and start to grow straight after it's planted. It just keeps getting bigger and bigger in diameter. They can actually strangle the taproot or strangle the trunk of the tree. So these wrapped around roots in time, they become girdling roots, which can be a real problem. And I remove much of the potting media also because it does not hold water very well. A lot of potting media are basically pine bark mixes with a little sphagnum moss and perlite, some other additives and amendments, but it's mostly pine bark, which is great for growing trees if you water it every day in the nursery. When it gets out into your environment, you want to replace a lot of that pine bark and light planting media with regular native soil, which holds moisture much more quickly and gives it up to the root system a little bit slower, and it's better for the tree. Excuse me. And notice the color of that root ball is quite dark as I've been keeping it wet down as we're taking these pictures and trimming on it. So this is what happens as the tree develops girdling roots. These are a couple of trees that did not have their roots pruned and teased out and pulled out at the time of planting. And in time, those roots get very, very large in diameter, and the tree trunk tries to grow and it gets bigger in diameter every year. And eventually they compete with each other. They can collapse the vessels and prevent sap flow from occurring either from those roots and the roots get damaged, or they can seal off they can crush the vessels on one side of a tree. Then you'll have part of the crown die back or part of the branches die back because it can't get sap flow up to that area. So here we are pruning the roots, also called roughening up the root ball. After teasing out the flexible roots on the surface that I can see, usually if they're pencil diameter or less, you can just kind of tease them out or untangle them. It's okay to break a few here and there, but if instead of cutting them off, you just pull them out and get them straightened out. And then I slice down through the root ball to cut any circling roots that are hidden. Notice how the blade of the pruner is just sunk deep right up to the hilt into that root system. So trying to cut any girdling roots that may have happened. Because just like we saw on those squared roots at the top of the soil surface, if it was in a small diameter pot, it can have a circle going maybe with a 6-inch diameter. If it was in a small 1-gallon pot or 8-inch diameter, then it gets moved up to a 5-gallon pot. And then you'll have another set of roots circled around at that 5-gallon circumference. So I try to cut any circling roots that are hidden. Again, note the dark color of the root ball. I kept it moist during this entire time. And some folks, I think, kind of take roughing up the root ball to extremes. It's kind of fashionable now in the arboriculture area to, just beat the heck out of the root system. They call it roughening up, and they'll tease it, remove all the potting media, strip out the roots, and try to make it look like a big bare root tree. And I think that's a little bit extreme because especially if they don't keep the root system wet like this, those fine fibrous roots will die within a few minutes of being exposed to the air. So if you roughen them up and rip off all the soil, the potting media, and spread out all those roots, a lot of those roots would be dead before you ever get them in the ground. So try to take a little more measured approach, keep it moist, tease out the roots you can, and then cut down through and remove quite a bit of the potting media, but you don't have to get completely obsessed with removing every flake of bark from that root system. Okay, so now this tree is ready to plant. We slice down through several places. We tease out these roots. We've got a couple of nice size diameter roots coming down from the base there. And it's from these larger diameter roots that when they've been cut and put in the hole, they'll make several new branches right behind that cut, almost like when you prune off a branch and you get 2 or 3 buds to break. Similar process happens with roots. You cut off a root like that, as we can see in this lower left-hand part of the picture, and it'll replace it with 2 or 3 new roots will grow out from that point. So this tree is ready to go in the ground now. Here the planting is complete except for a thorough watering. You can see our lateral root is right at the soil surface as it was before. We have a little bit of berm around the edge of the planting hole, a little bit of a raised area here. So as we add water in, we make a bit of a reservoir around the tree, and then the water percolates down through the soil. Here's a landscape view. You can see my water jugs there that I've been using to keep the root system damp. This tree just barely needed staking, but because it came with a bamboo splint, basically, that the trunk was attached right tightly to the bamboo in 4 or 5 places to hold it upright, I thought we should keep the stake and let it keep on there for a year. But the key thing is I loosened up the straps. I didn't use the tight straps that came from the nursery, but I just used some what they call flagging tape in the forestry field. Just used some flagging and double wrapped it around in 2 places so that the tree can move a little bit in the wind, but that won't flop over completely and damage the trunk or root system. Okay, so we're going to mention staking, trunk wrapping, and mulching also is some of the topics we cover. And how come I didn't do several of those things on this tree? Well, it just barely needed staking. As I mentioned, I just used the bamboo that came with the tree, but reattached it loosely so the tree can sway a bit. It's actually important for a tree to be able to move a little bit in the wind, basically so it knows it's in Kansas, knows it's got to develop a root system, develop more diameter before it gets any taller. This tree had lots of twigs and leaves on its lower trunk, so it had very little danger of sun scald. So this particular specimen, trunk wrapping was not needed. But I'll show you some other trees that we do need to wrap the trunks at the time of planting. And lastly, I like to delay mulching at least about a week or so that I've watered the tree several times and the soil is settled in. When you disturb soil and dig it up, put it back in the hole, the soil always seems to settle and shrink a little bit, and you lose some volume. And if you have a thick layer of mulch on top, it can be hard to see where you've lost that volume. It can be hard to see where you need to add extra soil to avoid or empty place beneath the root system. So I don't mulch till I've watered in several times, the soil is completely settled, and then I add the mulch. Okay, here's a diagram of a well-planted tree. They were a more ambitious digger than I was. They went to a full 3+ times the width of the root ball. They made kind of a shallow tapered hole. They have a good layer of mulch on there, and the mulch itself out away from the root system is higher than it is right near the stem surface. You don't need to mulch the trunk of the tree trying to insulate the root system. This particular stake is one that's not often used in the home landscape, but it wraps right around the base of the tree. But what really holds the tree upright is this stake here. This stake here has to be pounded down literally into the edge of the root ball. This staking method, you're actually stabilizing the root ball, not really stabilizing the trunk. If you keep the root ball firmly anchored, then the trunk will stand up on its own. Okay, root ball covers. In the case I just showed you, the tree was in a pot, so of course we take it out of the pot to plant. But many times larger trees are what they call balled and burlap. They'll be wrapped in a burlap material, or they might be in a wire basket if it's a tree spaded dug tree and a real big tree you're adding to your landscape. So the first rule, remove as much of the root ball cover as possible after the tree is properly positioned in the hole. And everyone agrees that that's where we want that tree located. If it's wrapped with natural burlap and twine, which is very common, you want to remove that from the top and most of the sides of the root system. You can leave a little bit of burlap in the bottom of the hole, and it's going to decay in a short period of time, in a year or two, down a wet, dark hole, and won't restrict root growth at all. However, some trees now are wrapped in what we call a synthetic burlap. It's kind of that plastic white woven material like grass seed may come in, or tube sand for the weight you put in the back of your truck in the winter. That synthetic burlap is very important to remove all of that, even from the bottom, because it actually breaks down in the sunlight. UV light breaks it down and makes it crumbly and fibrous and falling apart. But synthetic burlap, if it's in the bottom of the hole where the sun doesn't shine, the synthetic burlap will not break down, and roots will grow through that burlap and live for about a year. And when they go to get larger in diameter, they girdle themselves and die. Then a new skinny root takes its place. So it's important that synthetic burlap to remove all of that, especially from the bottom. This may mean you have to rock the tree back one way and pull the material out from underneath it, then rock it back the other way and pull more material coming out, because you don't want that synthetic burlap in the bottom of the hole. Finally, in addition to the fabric wrap, there may be a wire basket around it, and remove this from at least the top half of the root system. The old belief is that the wire would rust in a few years in the soil, not lead to a problem. So many trees are planted with the wire baskets in place. We've seen upper branches of a tree die, 10 years after planting. The tree seemed healthy, everything was going fine. Suddenly one large branch dies. We start to investigate the root system, and we find the wire basket is cut into the buttress root and damaged the root system. We found trees where they were planted 30 years ago and the wire basket is still intact. And the reason why you want to remove the wire basket primarily from the top half of the planting hole, the root system, is the buttress roots are the ones that grow out sideways in the soil and get very large in diameter, and those are found in the upper half of the root system. That's the large lateral roots that spread out and get very large. And when the wire basket cuts into those root systems, you get decay problems happening right at the root system, just below the soil surface. Okay, a few points about what not to do when planting a tree. I don't like to amend the backfill with things like peat or sand or compost. They all change how tightly that soil will hold water. If you put a lot of sand in there, you actually have to have mostly sand in the hole before it really increases drainage. If you just do half sand and half your clay soil, you end up with something more like concrete, which is a mixture of sand and limestone clay. Even peat moss and compost are usually good for the soil. If you till it up over a whole bed, that's great. But if you plant it just into the hole, if you just put that peat and compost into the hole, put your tree on top of it, when that compost continues to shrink and break down and settle, then your tree will be planted down into a basin, be planted too deep below the landscape level. So I don't like to add that kind of material. I'll put the compost on the soil surface as a mulch or as a first layer of mulch, but I don't like to mix it up into the soil and have the root system sitting on it, because then when it settles, it ends up shrinking. I also don't dig the hole deeper in the container. Again, this leads to that settling effect and the tree gets planted below grade. I don't prune it heavily at the time of planting to balance the root shoot ratio. It's just kind of a false idea. We saw from those earlier slides, you have to prune the root system pretty drastically. You cause a lot of damage, a lot of surgical cuts on that root system. My thought is we just let the tree concentrate on replacing the root system. When you prune back the top a lot too, trying to put it in balance, now the tree reacts. So I've got wounds at the top and the shoots. I've got damage down the root system. The phloem, the sugar, the growth regulators are all sent in these little tubes, these little xylem and phloem tubes. You can only send fluid one way in a tube at a time. Either it's going down to the root system to increase root growth or up to the top to increase top growth. You can't send things two directions at once in the same tube. So don't prune it heavily at time of planting. If there's some broken branches, of course, remove those, but don't prune heavily just to try to balance the root shoot ratio. Also, don't tightly stake the tree so it cannot sway. As I mentioned earlier, it's important for the tree to be able to sway in the wind so it gets acclimated and realizes it's in a windier environment from its sheltered nursery it left. And so it knows it's got to grow more roots and grow more diameter before the tree can get taller so it can adapt to its environment. Also, not recommend in general fertilizing at time of planting. A little bit of diluted liquid fertilizer is okay when you're watering the tree in, but trees really need very little fertilizer to get established. So I would wait to fertilize until early the next spring for a fall planted tree. If you plant in the spring, I'd wait until the first fall to do any fertilization. Let the tree get established and kind of grow slowly, get adapted to its environment before you're trying to start to push that growth with fertilizer. So a few tips on staking. For the home landscape, usually you don't need to use any more than 2 stakes. As we see in this diagram, 2 stakes is enough. It is important to use webbing or rubber hose over the wire or rope to form a loop. You don't want to just use even insulated wire with a little rubber insulation, because that will chafe in time and cut into the trunk. So you want to put it through a surgical hose or put it through a length of old water hose that had a garden hose that had leaked at one end. Save those and cut them up into lengths about 1 foot long, and put your rope or twine through that garden hose, and you let that garden hose be a cushion against the trunk. A place to attach these stakes and loops are at the base of the crown, loose enough to allow some movement. This particular picture here shows it just below the base of the crown. It makes it really easy if you loop these ties around some of these lower branches in the crown that helps hold it upright, and you can leave it a little bit loose so it can move in the wind just a little bit. In general, you can remove the stakes after the first year. If it was a real large planted tree, a big tree spade dug tree, or a real windy exposed environment, then maybe lower those ties after 1 year and move them at the end of the second year. Okay, this is what happens when the ties are too tight and left on too long. What happens is these ties are very, very tight, and again, they collapse the vessels in the phloem that allows the sugary water to flow from the crown of the tree down to the trunk to feed its diameter growth and cellular growth and down to the root system. When these ties are on there too tight, it collapses those vessels like pinching a hose and preventing the flow from occurring. So the sap, the sugary water, the food cannot get from the top of the tree down to the bottom. This is a very severe one. We've cut away the ties. You can see just how deeply indented it is. This is one that's not quite as severe. They wrapped it with a garden hose and also with bands of wrapping that wasn't quite as tight and damaged as these are. People often ask if this tree on the right hand side can be saved, and it depends on what the crown looks like. If the crown is still healthy and vigorous and no signs of dieback, then the root system is not dead yet. We could cut these ties, remove them, and in a few years the growth would compensate and fill that in nicely, and you kind of lose some of this Coke bottle shape. But if the crown of that tree is already showing some dieback, you've got some major branches that have died up there, turned color, and you don't know why, then the root system is already highly damaged and probably will not respond back and come back strongly after cutting these ties. Okay, a little bit about trunk wrapping and why they maybe need to prevent sun scald. I've planted trees in a couple of places. I started my career down in Oklahoma, and I planted several northern red oaks in my home landscape there. And that first summer, they got severe sun scald on the southwest side. So I realized I should have wrapped them to prevent that. And then I came up here to Kansas, and I planted several trees over the years. And when I did not wrap them, if they have a smooth, clear bark like this with no lower branches, they will quite often get sun scald that first year. I planted a pear tree in my yard, and the tag on the nursery said it came from the Green Valley Nursery in Texas. I said, well, that tree grew up in Texas. It's seen heat just like we have here in Kansas, or even worse, so I won't need to wrap it. By September of that first summer, it had sun scald all on the southwest side of the trunk. So on trees that don't have lower branches, that have a smooth trunk, as we see on this little tree right here, I really do recommend various trunk wraps. Trunk wraps have got kind of a bad rap because they were like the trees staking we saw earlier. They were they were bound up too tightly, left on too long, and led to some problems. But only use their saplings that have few lower branches or leaves. But best materials are the perforated plastic collars, which we'll see in the next slide. But these wrap types work well. This is a craft paper wrap we see here, kind of what they call a crinkly paper wrap that's a bit sheds water quite well, a bit hydrophobic. You can see this one is wrapped from the bottom up. This is quite important to wrap it from the bottom up, so each layer overlaps the one below it, so it's like overlapping shingles and sheds water away from the trunk. You don't want to wrap it from the top down. Then it's like a big funnel on the side of the trunk, and you get a lot of water trapped between the layers. And you should be able to remove that after 1 year. Okay, this is the perforated plastic coiled wrap, which works quite well. And this is tough enough material. You wrap it all the way down to the ground line, helps prevent rabbit damage in the winter, helps prevent string trimmers from scraping the bark and killing it also. Another type of tree wrap that's recently come on the scene is this polypropylene fabric material with lots of little holes all through it. This is just one particular brand of Job's, but several different companies make this kind of a wrap. What's nice about this wrap, it may be 3 to 4 inches wide. You see in this roll, if it's a real skinny diameter stem, like inch of diameter or less, you can just wrap it around the tree, fold it around, and staple it on the other side, so it sits like in a little envelope, a little pocket up and down the trunk of the tree. You don't have to wrap it and do all these overlapping layers. If it is a large diameter tree, you can wrap it like we saw on the craft paper in the previous slide. But the white works well. It reflects the sun's light and prevents it from getting quite so hot underneath there. It's well ventilated with little holes, and it works quite well. Okay, this is what happens when you don't wrap trees that need to be wrapped. Red maples, this is about the #1 damage we see on young red maples planted in Kansas. As I said, I grew up seeing red maples growing in the natural environment, which is along the edge of a pond or stream or swamp. They would call them swamp maples back there. They like lots of water. They don't mind shade. And then we take a red maple that, the seed source was from New Hampshire or northern Michigan, and then we grow it in the nursery and then plant it out on a south-facing lawn here in Kansas with no shade around it. So these are some red maples that were planted in my neighborhood. It was my eye doctor that had planted these. Actually, a very reputable nursery planted a whole bunch of them in the yard, planted about 8 of them, and they didn't wrap any of them. And I got a call from him one night saying, "Can you come look at my trees? They look sick." And I said, "I'll be glad to give you a professional visit, doctor's house call," because when my glasses broke one Friday evening, he was able to repair them with tools he had and equipment he had at his house. So I said, "I'll be glad to give you a free professional visit and look at your trees as the tree doctor." And you can see we had some sun scald here. This one is not too severe, but you see in this one on the left, these cracks mean that the cambium has been dead underneath that bark right there, about 1 foot long, about 3 or 4 inches wide. So he's got a pretty good scar there. The one on the right is much more severe. It's just progressed a little bit further. This one had sun scald about 5 feet from the first branch down to the root system. You can see that bark is sloughed off, and now the callus tissue is trying to grow back around it. And the question people always give us is, what can we do now? What can we wrap the tree with? Can we put asphalt paint or whitewash or something to help it heal? Once this damage has occurred, there's nothing you can do to help it heal. The key thing is to prevent it with trunk wrap, or prevent it by selecting a tree with lots of lower branches, like my little oak that you saw earlier in the presentation, or by simply not planting trees like red maple that are so susceptible to sun scald in our hot environment. When I visited these trees in the late summer, I could see that each one was burned right on the southwest side of the trunk. You think of when the sun is at its hottest in July and August, what direction is that sun coming in from? It's coming in from on a southwest angle when we get up to 100 degrees, and that's where it just damages this cambium, just cooks it, burns it up with a severe sunburn, and then the tree has a dead spot always in that location. Now this tree is damaged so badly here, we're going to get decay starting in here, and the tree may live for another 15, 20 years in the landscape. It's going to get much bigger in diameter, but it's going to be hollow inside, and that decay is going to continue to progress over time. And then we'll get a high wind event like we're prone to get them in Kansas, and this tree will snap off of the ground line or snap off here at the maximum damage point. And but the actual damage was done 20 years earlier when the little tree was planted and should have been wrapped. Okay, a little bit about mulching, how not to mulch. This is a common in the landscape, 2 different examples of it here. This is what we call the mountain or the volcano of mulch, where it's too thick around the base of the tree. What you want to do is not have it around the base of the tree. You want an even layer, trying to insulate the root system of the soil, not the trunk. Also, some mulches can become kind of hydrophobic. When red cedar mulch gets really dry, it can actually kind of shed water. And so with a steep size like this, you'll actually get water shed away and pushed away, draining away from the root system instead of collecting in the root system and giving it a drink it needs. So don't make a volcano or a mountain of mulch when you're mulching your landscape. Okay, correct mulching will be a large ring, but it'll be quite level in appearance. No grass, but it appears quite level on this maple and this pine tree. Okay, one thing you can say, Matt in Wichita came up with mulching like a donut. There's a hole in the center. You're trying to insulate the root system and not the trunk. So the hole in the center is where the trunk grows up through there. Make them circular in shape, and lots of flavors, and they're all good. Whether you use pine bark or wood chips or cocoa burr, husk or straw, they all do well. Any kind of organic material will break down, add nutrients and humic acid to the soil, and need to be added in time to keep the depth there. But any kind of organic material can make a good mulch. So mulching tips in general: add mulches until it's 2 to 4 inches deep, again around the root system of that tree and the planting hole. You can use up to 6 inches if it's loose, fresh wood chips, like if a tree trimming, utility trimmers in your neighborhood and you ask them to dump their chopped mulch on the corner of your yard that you could use for free. You know, if it's loose, fresh wood chips, you can go even 6 inches deep. And within a very short period of time, it's going to be settled down to about 3 to 4 inches deep in a short period of time. Stay away at least 36 inches from the base of the trees. Again, you're insulating the root system, not the trunk. And any size mulch area is better than a non-mulched area. But ideally, for newly planted trees, go for a 3 to 6 foot diameter circle around that tree. We found that turf grass is very competitive against the root system of young trees, and the larger the circle of mulch you make, the more mulch, the quicker that tree will get established, the faster it'll grow. Now, existing trees, you really only need to have a minimum about a foot of mulch. You know, if a sapling has 6 feet of mulch, you think a big tree would need 10 to 20 foot circle. But really, you're just trying to prevent the mower from getting right up to the trunk of that larger tree. So just having a foot distance there of mulch as a buffer to prevent that is all you need. Because remember, there's very few root tips growing around the base of that tree. The root system of that large established tree is spread way out beyond the branches. So we don't need a big circle of mulch, just a small mulch to keep the string trimmer and the mower away. And again, use organic mulches whenever possible because they break down and improve the soil. Some folks like to use chopped up rubber tires for mulch. It's kind of a permanent mulch, but it doesn't add nutrients to the soil. And some folks use gravel for mulch. That can lead to heating of the soil. And again, it doesn't add any organic matter to the soil at all. Okay, there's a few different species differences on fall tree planting. Not everything can be treated just the same. For example, comparing conifers versus deciduous trees, conifers should really be added to your environment added to your lawn landscape by about mid-October, because you got to allow a little bit more root growth to occur before the ground freezes, because evergreens will continue to transpire water. They'll absorb water and evaporate out their leaves and needles on mild days all winter long. So also midwinter watering will often be needed. So if you're the kind of person who likes to roll up their hoses after they rake the leaves in October, put them in the attic, put them in the basement and not use them again until spring, then you might want to think twice about planting trees in the fall. But if you're willing to do some midwinter watering, especially on your evergreens, it will oftentimes be needed. And again, in my own neighborhood, I've seen pin oaks transplanted on Thanksgiving week. And I wondered, boy, is that too late here for Kansas? And it was not. They came through the winter fine. There's a couple of the healthiest trees in the neighborhood, and they were planted about third week of November, and they still did fine. But again, they were watered in well and mulched in well. There are just a few species, very few species, that do not put on much root growth in the fall. Studies have shown there's a short list of these trees, but ones that are commonly planted, perhaps in Kansas, include redbud, very common. The magnolias, tulip poplar, and flowering dogwood are all species that don't put on much root growth in the fall. So if you're going to add these to the landscape, might recommend you wait until the spring planting season to do that. Okay, before we shift gears and talk about some recommended trees to plant for fall color, do you have any questions on tree planting or anything we've covered so far, Brooke?
Yes, I do. If we want to go over a few questions, I'll just go through like a few and then we'll hit the rest at the end. So,
okay.
Do you recommend amending the fill soil with a mycorrhizal inoculant?
Right. I haven't really seen any real value in any studies that have been done with that mycorrhiza, the inoculant there, the mycorrhiza inoculant. All trees do need mycorrhiza, but usually there's enough of them in the soil, or they're already basically infected or have the mycorrhiza from the nursery coming out to the planting location. The one exception to that is if some nurseries, if you buy the package of mycorrhizal inoculant, they'll double or triple the insurance or the time of guarantee of tree survival. So instead of saying they guarantee a tree survives for 6 months or a year, they'll guarantee it for 3 or 5 years. So if you're buying an expensive tree, you may want to use the mycorrhiza just that basically as an insurance policy to help guarantee that tree a little bit longer.
Cool. And then someone had heard that there's this recommendation to mound some soil in the bottom of the hole and then spread the roots out around the mound to encourage outward growth of the roots. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, that's a technique that can work if you've taken a lot of the soil away from that root system, particularly in the picture that I had where, the bottom few inches, I'd taken away a lot of that loose potting media. You want to make sure there's plenty of soil in there for the roots to get good root soil contact. It's tough to really make a big mound and then spread the roots out, because as you're adding the soil, things can get compressed and passed in. But you do need to have some soil in the bottom of that hole so the root systems get good contact with the soil and can absorb water.
Okay. And then do you need to wrap the tree if it's going to be shaded by other trees?
No, if it's pretty well shaded, especially on the south and west side, then I would not need to wrap it, unless you're going to wrap it to protect it from a string trimmer or rabbits or like that.
Okay.
But it's
And
just
then,
trees that are exposed to the sun.
and then just one clarification, when does the damage from sun scald occur? And then when should people wrap their trees?
Right. Yeah, there's two kind of schools of thought on that. In my own landscape, I've planted trees in April and seen the damage in September. So that the sun scald happens that first winter. There's another kind of sun scald, they've been given the name Southwest disease, where it's related to kind of the sap flow when you get a warm, mild weather in the rapid warming in the winter. The roots are in frozen ground, and the plant gets heated up on the west side, southwest side, and it can absorb water to keep it hydrated. So you get some kind of desiccation damage, especially on things like arborvitae and some evergreens. You get kind of southwest, you get dying needles in the southwest. That's actually a sun scald that happens in the winter related to the frozen soil. But the sun scald on the trunk of the tree, I'm convinced that most of it happens that first summer during hot weather.
Okay. And then I'll ask just two more questions and I'll let
Sure.
you finish out your presentation. We still have a lot kind of piling in, but if you could just answer, when should stakes be removed? And then there's just a couple questions about root stimulators. So if you could just cover when root stimulators should be used. So stake.
Sure. Yeah, the stakes, if it's a smaller tree, like we've seen in several of these pictures, they can remove it at the end of the first year after they've been in the ground for a year. If it's a real large tree and you're in a very windy, exposed environment, I'd lower the ties a little bit, loosen the stakes a little bit so the tree can move a little bit more and see if it's still stable, and let it stay like that for another year and then remove the stakes.
Okay. And then just a quick clarification on the stake. Should the staking be below the branching, or can the staking be right above the bottom branching?
Right. The loop coming from the stake to the tree can go around those lowest branches. That's actually where I like to do it, what they call right at the base of the crown, so the loop is wrapped around a branch. And that helps keep the loop from sliding down the trunk, getting too low, but it stabilizes in the upper part of the trunk and still move.
Okay.
Yep.
Perfect.
And the root stimulator is kind of the same story as the mycorrhiza. I don't think they really help the tree that much. In horticulture, we'll use root stimulator, rooting hormone. We're trying to root a bare wood cutting, trying to get it to grow roots. You're trying to trick the twig to growing roots, growing tissue it doesn't have. But if the tree already has a root system, trying to trick it into growing more roots, I don't think it's really necessary for the health of the tree.
Perfect. You actually knocked out a couple other questions at the same time, because someone did ask about planting bare root seedlings. So, and tips and tricks for that. So you would suggest a root stimulator for those?
Well, if they already have the root system, no. It's when it's a bare twig, like when you're trying to root like greenwood cutting, then they need hormone. But if they already have roots, I don't think you need to trick the tree into growing more roots if it already has them.
Great. Good advice. All right, I'll let you continue, and then you'll have about 10 questions. So.
Okay, great. Just have a few slides on recommended trees for different, for a good fall color. Okay, recommendations for fall color. The absolute number one I put on my list is not unanimous. If you talk to different horticulturists, some people say we're overplanting these trees, but the absolute number one in my list would be the Fermani hybrid maples. They were first identified by a botanist with the name of Freeman. And they're actually a cross between red and the silver maple. And for what I've seen, they've got better characteristics of both. They have much stronger wood than the silver maple. Silver maple is our native maple, widely adapted to streamside sites throughout the eastern half of the state, but it does have brittle wood. They can suffer catastrophic branch loss with some high winds. And red maple is a much stronger wood. So the hybrid has stronger wood than the silver maple, more like the red maple, but it's much better adapted to our dry plains environment than red maple. We've seen red maples suffer in a lot of sites in Kansas, and we've seen the Freeman maples do quite a bit better. There are several different selections of these hybrids depending on the genetic parentage of the red maple parent and the silver maple parent. But some of the sold is Freeman's maple or Autumn Blaze, a very popular one. Autumn Fantasy is one, also one called Marmo. These are all trees that have very brilliant colors, just guaranteed brilliant colors. Quite often they'll start off yellow in the fall and then transition to this bright red, as you see in the upper right hand picture. This picture here is of a Freeman maple. Notice the shape of the leaf is like a silver maple, but the color is more like a very bright red maple. Also, one that is more universally acceptable or promoted by folks who know is a member of the black maple group. It's actually a black maple is really a western subspecies of sugar maple. Sugar maple, the true sugar maple species, just barely gets into the eastern edge of Kansas, south of Kansas City, and near towns called Sugarton and Sugar Creek. They have some true sugar maple. But anything west of that is actually a black maple. And there's some black maples they call Caddo maple, which comes from a county in central Oklahoma. So it's a long way from what we call the sugar maple range of Michigan to New Hampshire. But it comes in Caddo County in central Oklahoma. They've set several selections of that population with cultivar names like Autumn Splendor and John Pear and Morton. Morton's also called Crescendo, but the John Pear and Autumn Splendor, both selections of Caddo maple that have been proven to do well down at the Wichita Horticulture Center, Horticulture Research Site. And so if you can find the Caddo maple or the name varieties Autumn Splendor, John Pear, I really recommend them as being more like a sugar maple. So it wouldn't have the serrated leaves like we see here, but it had that bright orangey to red color. Okay, other large trees that color up nicely in the fall, they can color up nicely. One is northern red oak. It's called red oak because it turns red to reddish orange in the fall, but not consistently. It depends on where that tree came from. Is it a northern red oak from Arkansas or is it northern red oak from Michigan? The northern varieties, the northern ones will tend to color up earlier. Shumard oak is very much like northern red oak, and again, some of those turn red. White oak is just, barely gets into the state in terms of its native adaptation. It needs a rich soil, a little more water than the northern red oak. But some of these can just turn a brilliant, rich burgundy, purple, and red in the fall. But again, they don't all consistently turn that color. So any of the trees on this list, you want to do that selection in October at the nursery to see if they're going to color up nice. And finally, sweet gum is one that grows quickly here in Kansas. And I used to live, as I said, in Oklahoma, and down there it turns a variety of colors, red, yellow, purple. They had a beautiful, rich, deep purple. Again, it's growing in its native environment in a wetland site near a stream along a pond or lake. Here I see them up in Kansas, we get a few leaves turning yellow, and then a hard freeze comes along in mid-November, and the leaves all turn greenish brown and kind of die on the tree, and they never get around to getting colored up. Two varieties that do well in Kansas are the Moraine and the Ward or Cherokee cultivars of sweet gum. So if you're going to plant a sweet gum in your yard, again, they're fast growing, they can have shallow roots, they can lift sidewalks. It's not a perfect tree, but they will do well here in Kansas, and the Moraine and Ward are known to color up a little more consistently here in the state. For small trees, there's two that I'd mentioned. One is the Amur maple. It really dependably turns red. These leaves look a lot like red maple, but the central lobe, the central point is much longer than a regular red maple. It grows shaped more like a crabapple tree, kind of a small spreading tree, 10 to 15, maybe up to 20 feet tall for a large one. Some of the cultivars of this that we more consistently would color up, more consistent growth would be compactum, embers, or flame in the Amur maple species. Finally, for a tree that's even a little bit smaller, the service berries are quite nice, and they turn orange. We don't have many trees or small trees here in Kansas that turn that nice bright orange color. But some varieties and species there, the Allegheny service berry, spring flurry is a cultivar, and autumn brilliance is another type of service berry that will be a small tree in the landscape but turn a bright orange in the fall. And last, I say don't overlook shrubs that color. Really, we can have trees, the shrubs that color up more dependably than our trees do here in Kansas. For example, burning bush euonymus, which we see in the picture here on the right side of the slide, it's just kind of the classic. It's called burning bush because it just is flame red in the fall every year consistently. Our native sumacs color up very nicely too in the fall, including the fragrant sumac, the small, low-growing sumac, and the taller staghorn and smooth sumac with the long compound leaves will turn bright red, very hot red in the fall. Even our native rough-leaved dogwood is kind of colored up now in the landscape, turns a rich burgundy to purple in mid to late September. Quite often it's underappreciated because the other trees, shrubs out there haven't started to color yet, so people haven't noticed it. But the rough-leaved dogwood turns a nice purple in mid to late September here in Kansas. We have a number of native trees that turn yellow. Yellow is an easier color to get because the chlorophyll breaks down. You see the yellow. Hickory is turning a nice dark yellow. Cottonwood is turning a pretty light yellow, but it's so windy here in Kansas that as soon as the leaf turns yellow, we get a windy day and it gets stripped off and gone. Hackberry will turn yellow. American linden basswood turns a bright yellow, but it needs kind of a rich soil in a sheltered planting location. And there are many ash cultivars which were chosen for leaf coloration, but due to emerald ash borer, we've taken them off the list because emerald ash borer is just killing all the ashes in eastern half of Kansas so far. Finally, some of this information came from the Shade Ornamental Trees of Kansas book or bulletin that was written by Griffin and Davis back in 2005. It's called MF 2688 on the K-State Research Extension Publication series. I think Brooke is going to put a link for that publication out in the chat information. Okay, now we're ready for questions. These trees here are all the same tree, taken over a couple of different seasons and times. It's the Freeman maple across from Throckmorton Hall, Manhattan. It starts out coloring up yellow actually in August, awful early, but I think it's from a northern source. And you see this is actually the same tree here. It turns red in a few of the branches. Eventually, all the leaves turn reddish orange, and that's a close-up of the brilliant color of the leaf there. Again, the silver maple shape, but the red maple color. Okay, Brooke, ready for the last questions before we have to sign off?
Okay, I kind of split the questions up between specific tree questions, tree planting, and tree damage. So specific tree questions in regards to the Sweet Bay magnolia. Are you saying not to plant this tree in the fall?
Yes, the reference we have just talked about magnolia. It didn't say Sweet Bay in particular, but all the magnolias are a little fussy and a little tender for transplanting, so I probably do those in early spring.
Okay. And we had a participant that planted her Sweet Bay magnolia in July, and she believes that she's probably watered it too much. The leaves are yellowing and dropping. Like, what's kind of next steps that you recommend?
Yeah, next steps is in about February or early March. I'd see if the twigs are still alive, scrape the bark a little bit, and if they're green inside and the tissue is still flexible and is still alive, and let it try to leaf out in the spring. If the twigs are brittle, you can snap them off on your finger. If you scrape them and they're just brown inside, it probably needs to be replaced with a new Sweet Bay magnolia, but plant it in late March, early April, kind of the ideal tree planting time to give it a fair shake. Planting trees in July in Kansas is a tough go.
Yeah. And then what about a native gray dogwood? Would that be planted in the fall?
If you can find them and get them, it probably could be planted in the fall. The study we looked at, I just mentioned, flowering dogwood is the common landscape dogwood, and the rough-leaved dogwood is a hardy enough shrub that just grows wild in pastures and fields. It will probably take okay to a fall transplanting.
Okay. And then with fruit and nut trees, are those also planted in the fall? We just kind of had a lot of those questions today.
Yeah, they can be if you can get good quality plants this time of year. Usually a lot of fruits and nut trees are planted as bare root trees, and so they're mostly available in the spring season. But you could plant those in the fall, apple or pear trees or like that. Yeah.
Okay. So kind of moving on to more like tree damage questions. What do you do if the wire was still around the trunk after 7 years? Do you cut the wire? Is that kind of a hard question?
Right. Yeah, if the crown of the tree still looks pretty healthy, it doesn't have a lot of crown dieback, cut that wire, unwrap it, pull it out of there, and let the tree kind of compensate and respond to that growth. If the crown is already half dead and then you discover the wire cutting into it, cut your losses and start over. That is probably just too much root damage has occurred.
Okay. And then stakes on a 2-year-old tree were too tight for one of our participants. What recommendations do you have?
Well, if they've been on there 2 years, you can take them off now. They should be, root system should be established enough the tree will stand up on its own.
Okay.
So just take them off.
Yeah, I hope we got that question. And then what if your new 5-inch tall arborvitae tree was staked with wire wrap and it stayed on for 7 years? Just discovered the wire in the trunk. Besides cutting the wire, what else needs to be done? So I think you kind of answered that question indirectly.
Yeah, that's probably about all that needs to be done. Just cut as much of that wire as you can without cutting into the bark or damaging the tree, because the tree can grow, the trunk of the tree can grow over wire pretty well. It grows over barbed wire in a pasture pretty easily and reestablishes its link on the other side, and the sap continues to flow. But just cut as much of that wire that you can see, get it out of there.
Okay. And then is it safe to assume that trees sold at nurseries in the fall are okay to plant in the fall?
Fairly, yes, you can assume that. I had a real short list of trees that do well in Kansas, but are not recommended for fall planting. So the magnolias, the red buds, and those on the list. But yeah, if they're offered for sale, they should do fine with the right care.
I know we're kind of coming up on the very end of our presentation, so we probably have time for like one more question.
Okay, pick a good one.
So if you don't remove the natural burlap until it's in the hole, how do you do all of the root pruning, etc.?
Right. You open up the burlap, and if it's been grown most of the time in the field and it's bald and burlap, you may not need to do much root pruning. The root pruning we talk about is primarily when they come in a container, when they've been grown in a pot. So what I would do is set it in the hole and unwrap the burlap and see what the root system looks like. And again, if you make the root system wide, the hole wide enough, you can still operate and have room to get around and find those roots. But most bald and burlap trees don't have that girdling root problem because they haven't spent a lot of time in a pot. They've been field grown and then dug and burlapped.
All right. Well, just a reminder, this is going to be recorded, everyone. So we had a couple questions about getting the slides. We don't actually provide the slides, but we will provide the recording link, and that'll be available on our website. I'm going to pass it back to Ron to kind of close us out, but I will send the link to our website in the chat one more time.
Okay, Dr. Barden, thank you very much. So that was excellent. So everybody, just once again, thank you for joining us today. And remember to check the K-State Garden Hour website for more upcoming programs that we're going to have here at the end of September, and then once a month, October through December. And so again, like Brooke said, this session has been recorded and it should be posted tomorrow afternoon on the website for you to view. And after the webinar ends today, you should get a prompt asking you to take an evaluation survey. We would appreciate it if you would do that, and that greatly helps us getting feedback from the program. So if you have other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at ksuemg@ksu.edu. So thank you again and have a great week.